And you say, what is your opinion? And he will say, well, we do not really know either. But from our researching and from our thought, we suspect that these monuments are older than the American school believes. We would like to suspect that these monuments might go back 1,000, maybe 2,000 years before the Christian era, and that they were built by peoples who preceded the historical group in the Valley of Mexico. This assumes, of course, the existence of a pre-Aztec culture in this area. And according to the German viewpoint, the existence of such a culture is intimated in the remaining records of the Nahua peoples, for they distinctly seem to imply that these monuments were ancient at the time when they first reached the great plateau of Mexico. So the German scientist is inclined to be a little more generous. Then you turn to the Mexican scientist, who actually is in a strange way in the best condition and position to understand the achievements of his own people. He has had his ear to the ground for a long time, is well aware of the legendary and lore that are definitely parts of the descent of our records in this region. And with a typical Mexican shrug of the shoulders, he will say, we do not know when they were built, senor. It is our opinion that perhaps they were built 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. But we are convinced that they are far more ancient than has been suspected. And that the only reason why the present fashion is to insist that they are recent is because our whole concept of culture is based upon the concept that man's more recent state indicates a superior attainment. Therefore, that the man of the dawn of time could not have produced such monuments. Our picture of him does not permit him to have such ingenuity and advancement. But remember that we have no picture of this man except the one we ourselves have invented, so that we are really locked by our own invention. We have come to a conclusion, and we are trying to make the facts fit into the conclusion. In other words, we are reasoning from a conclusion and not toward one. This is, generally speaking, the attitude in nearly all parts of the world relating to ancient monuments. The modern materialistic school insisting upon everything being recent. The more conservative Teutonic mind being a little slower to arrive at such an end or finding, and the native peoples, whether scholarly or unscholarly, uniting in the concept of an extraordinary antiquity to certain of their most famous monumental structures. We do, of course, in some cases, enjoy native records. Our present tendency, however, is to assume that most natives are liars from the beginning, that either they have no knowledge of their own antiquity or have gone off into romancing and into myth and folklore to the degree that their records are not reliable. Actually, however, when we go back beyond a certain point, we have only mythology, only legendary, and only lore. If we eliminate these completely, we simply have no contact at all with man prior to the dynastic rise in Egypt. Thus we can say that some of these buildings may be recent, some of them may be ancient. Explorations on the site of the Great Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza on the peninsula of Yucatan now indicates one building under another, and various estimates of from 9 to 15 structures inside of that one temple have already been advanced, indicating a sacred site, rebuilt or overbuilt many times over a vast period of history. Thus, by degrees, the need for a concept of a culture, a comparatively advanced culture, appears over the horizon as we begin to seek reasonable or rational explanations for familiar things. So much for the physical level of our functioning. Now let us move to an entirely different theater of consideration, a different area requiring penetration. We are completely confused as to the origin of language. We have some rather skillful thoughts about it, but still we are unable to explain a number of important things. We accept much, question little, and hope for the best. On another level, equally important, we are without any adequate knowledge as to the origin of the sciences that we now consider basic. Who invented mathematics and when? This question would really probably prove disconcerting even to the best historian of mathematics. We simply do not know. Wherever we find the person or the condition which seems to suggest origination, we immediately strike a legend, or immediately strike a statement of that person that his knowledge was derived from some other source. We cannot pin down the original of these different forms of learning. This is especially true when we turn from history to Stonehenge, or to the great Druidic or pre-Druidic monuments in Brittany, in France. Here, immense mazes, tremendous architectural structures, covering huge areas, and arranged with considerable mathematical skill, must certainly precede the periods in which we believed mathematics to be available to man. We are therefore searching religiously, philosophically, scientifically, ethnologically, anthropologically, for the beginning of the human race. Not its physical beginning, merely as creature, but the beginning of its ascent from savagery or a primitive state to the levels or to the platforms which can come within investigation by available instruments. Where then can we turn? Probably the only way we can turn is that in which most have turned, who have sought to penetrate the almost intentional wall of oblivion that has been built up by opinion, attitude, and prejudice between us and the origin of our own culture. Men like Baron de Prorock, seeking vestiges of ancient foundations off the coast of Europe. Men like Leo Frobenius, seeking the solution of the mystery of Africa. These men instinctively associate their problem with a prehistorical empire, or a prehistorical diffusion of high culture, and have found it convenient to accept the general term Atlantean to suggest that culture in the light of the celebrated account left by Plato. So let us think for a moment about Plato's record, as we are to deal first in our first evening with the Greek-Egyptian foundation of the Atlantic fable. We have every reason to believe that the discussion of the Atlantic island contained in the writings of Plato arose from the maturity of his years and has been preserved for us in the collected works of one of the greatest minds and the most admired intellects that humanity has produced. It would be difficult indeed to assume that the author of the Statesman and the Republic, the man whose mind so accurately and astutely estimated nearly every social and human problem, could have merely been fictionalizing or have been himself easily deceived by some legend or lore. The actual story of Atlantis, as recorded by Plato, came to him from one of his disciples, a young man descended from the old Athenian lawgiver Solon. Solon, who flourished about the 6th century BC, was one of the 7 wise men of Greece. And it is very important to realize at this time that Solon is not included among philosophers, nor is he considered a mystic. He is not regarded as a scientist, and he was certainly not a theologian. Solon was exactly what our modern semantic association with the word Solon would indicate. He was a statesman. As a statesman, he was bound to the political and physical problems of his country. His primary contribution to Athenian life was a solution to the problem of the mortgage stones, which were heaped up on the corners of land to indicate various easements and various financial liens upon the properties. As during the course of centuries these properties changed hands and were mortgaged and remortgaged, a situation of considerable complication arose. The heaps of mortgage stones became so large there was no land left to till. So Solon had to fight with the problem of the ancestral and historical indebtedness of the Greek peoples. He solved this rather neatly, and also is remembered as the man who liberated the Grecians from the unhappy and difficult law permitting imprisonment for debt. It was not until the Middle Ages in Europe that this law was revived, and we are happy to say that it is now gone. If it wasn't gone today, there'd be no one out of jail. Now, Solon visited Egypt because of the general respect of the Grecians for the political and diplomatic skill of the Egyptian rulers. Egypt was a theocracy, uniting in the person of the pharaoh both priest and king. Egypt was also deeply versed in ancient laws and had a very skillfully developed